Welcome to a lecture in the History and Forms of Lyric series. I'm very happy to have the occasion to introduce Cal Bedient today. Cal has been teaching 19th and 20th century British and American literature at UCLA for many, many years. He speaks to us today as a critic about the predicament of modern poetry. Cal has published 4 very highly regarded books of criticism. The first, Architects of Self, in 1972, was devoted to George Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, and E.M. Forster. I didn't read that book then when it came out, but I had already begun to read Cal then. I was an MA student at UCLA, I think, when I read an essay of his. I think it was on Charles Tomlinson. And that essay and a number of other essays came together in his second book, which is 8 Contemporary Poets, a book on British poetry. I didn't meet Cal then when I was studying at UCLA. I was just there for a year. I was too shy, I think, to search him out. I think he may have been on leave then in any case. But I knew that he was writing very acutely about contemporary poets then, and I was interested. And he was writing about poets I knew nothing about, British poets. And that was a very original book because I wasn't the only one who didn't know British poetry then. Cal was really educating people with that book. So it was my loss that I didn't get to meet Cal then, didn't get to study with him at UCLA, and I've often reflected back on that as I've read his later books. In 1984, he published In the Heart's Last Kingdom, Robert Penn Warren's major poetry. One of the wonderful things about this book, and there are several wonderful things about the book, is its independence and its directness. Penn Warren had then, in 1984, been writing for a good half century, but Cal turned immediately to what was then Warren's most recent poetry. And as a literary critic, Cal had the courage to focus exclusively on the best of Penn Warren's poems and not try to explain the whole career, as most academic critics would feel obliged to do. What needed explanation instead was the appearance of surprising poems from a poet who had been writing for so long. In the Heart's Last Kingdom showed very clearly what a brilliant critic Cal is, brilliant critic of poetic style in particular, and also what a writerly critic he is, as those of you know who read him. 2 years later, the University of Chicago Press published Cal's tour de force study of the wasteland, He'd do the police in different voices. This is a very close, patient reading of the entire poem. Cal read Eliot very close to the grain of the voices that he hears in the poem. One of the striking features of Cal's criticism in this book and in later essays is his effort to test the theoretical claims of Bakhtin and Kristeva in this book on the closest possible sort of interpretation of a very canonical poem. I see this phase of his work as a writing across an intellectual rift in the academic literary culture between what theorists propose and what poets write. Since his Eliot book, Cal has written too many essays to enumerate here, but he's tracked contemporary poetry in reviews. He's a vigorous reviewer of contemporary poetry. And he has done something very unusual. In 1997, he published his first book of poems, Candy Necklace. And then another book of poems, The Violence of the Morning, in 2002. I think Chiku will say something about these books tomorrow. Cal is a critic who always wrote as a poet. And now in his maturity, he's known as a young poet. That's a wonderful career. Please join me in welcoming Cal Bedient.
you, Bob, for that generous introduction. I hope you appreciate the fact that Bob and I have spent weeks coordinating our haircuts for this event. It's like, in a lecture on the predicament of modern poetry, I was shocked after agreeing to give this lecture many weeks ago to be asked right away for a title. And, so I threw this out and I decided to stick with it for better or worse. And the subtitle is The Lyric at the Pench Gate. There are some quotations in the talk which are not indicated by he said or she observed or whatever. And I think I won't do the rabbit ear thing. Just follow the rule that if it sounds really good, it's a quotation. Okay. So the mic's okay. In the back, the mic's okay. The predicament of modern poetry. Thesis 1. Always a genre of the wound. The lyric is now often in a valedictory state, confessedly self-belated, dog-dayed, dog-eared. Thesis 2. Done for unless it takes its lumps, links itself to what flies off at a tangent from it, or acts against it. Elaboration of the first thesis. That brilliant Blue of the Moon musician, that monger of gentle pathos, Charles Wright, provides us with an exemplary text. It's in the handout. Mondo Orfeo, collected in 2002 in his book, A Short History of the Shadow. 3/4 moon, last of November. 5 o'clock afternoon, acolytes of the tactile, servants of the articulate, the infinite festers in our bones, sundown and a drained blue from the sky so long, ghosts whispers, lost voices, dry wind and dry grass, our bitter song. Our song resettles no rocks, it makes no trees move, it has come to nothing, this sour song, but it's all we've got. And so we sing it, being ourselves matter we have no choice in. Zone wind out of Thrace, were we elsewhere, which we're not, but would be, oak trees still standing where he left them, Orpheus, whose head bobbing, river tongue has no stop, whose song has no end. For us, however, it's box canyon and bad weather, and what comes next? It's wind rasp, its index finger to puckered lips, its saint shush. Even those of us who've never been sure what the definition of the lyric is will probably concede that this poem must be one. At least it's about someone's mood painted from the inside in an apparently impelled, spontaneous utterance. What's more, it's a lyric about the historical embitterment of the lyric. It spans the gap so as to acknowledge the divide between Orphean lyricism, which is mythic, and the contemporary lyric, which is sourly dubbed this sour song. For the sake of creating a deliciously hurt feeling, the poem indulges the famous rumor of a power of song that, accompanied by the lyre, that the instrument that gives its name to the lyric, made rock, trees, and beast bow to its will to harmonize the me and the not me, feeling and substance. Going far into credulous complicity with the myth, Wright predicates, not without fond redundancy, that even after the Maenads dismember Orpheus for ignoring their attractions, and his head is borne away by the river Hebrus, his tongue has no stop, his song no end. By contrast, Ovid, a tougher spirit, describes the floating head as sadly singing and tells of how it washes up on the shores of Lesbos, where that tireless tongue, so understandably infuriating to the Maenads, finally quits. If Wright erases from the myth Orpheus's mortality, if he wants to believe that somewhere else in some other time the will to sing could be prolonged indefinitely, even in a torn-off head, The reason is to make appear pathetic our kind of song, his kind, song that can feel defeat in the pit of its stomach, the pronoun our being a faked collective, swallowing everybody, just as the word sour in turn swallows our. Our kind of song feels a lost sovereignty vis-a-vis matters complicity with time. With its technique of the fragment catalog, three-quarters moon, dry wind, zone wind, etc., it hangs in lassitude from a peg of sorrow. Our senses just see how they get us down, how lowering they are, have us quartered, Novembered, sundowned. Always already perhaps we are hollow men, ghost whispers raised by dry wind in dry grass. For Wright is one of those grieving writers for whom, as Beckett said, birth is given astride the grave. The poem has its merits, its all too beautiful merits, but for me, as I've hinted and as my ungenerous tone has indicated, the writing is emotionally soft and dishonest. It thus twists the lyric further into its comfortable socket of misery. It may also be confused as to its real grievance, which is not that time ends our song, but that we have to be articulate at all, can't simply be instantly infinite. It regrets song itself. We are material, boned, therefore the infinite festers in us. We're not just sour, our souls are sick. Mondo Orfeo is a religious lyric foiled as such, turned back on its shelf even as it slips and coaxes into our 5 o'clock lives, Roman Catholic terminology. Acolytes, if ironically just of the tactile, servants, if just of the articulate, and egregiously Saint Shush, the figure that accomplishes the poem's self-silencing and a closing line that knows no shame when it comes to being picturesque. Compare Mondo Orfeo to another poem that invokes Orpheus, Jory Graham's terrifying What the End Is For, in her third book, The End of Beauty. I'll touch on this longish poem only briefly, though it deserves better, as a stepping stone to a more general argument about what the lyric now needs to do, in my opinion, to survive. Perhaps you'll remember that Graham's poem begins with a description of 500 B-52s on alert, on the runway, fully loaded, fully manned, pointed in all directions, running every minute of every day. You may even remember that these are Graham's exact words. Hardly lyrical. In fact, hardly poetry. As Graham goes on to note that she and the boy who took her to see the plains in Grand Forks, North Dakota, watch from where even watching is an anachronism. All modernity, not least the technology and finance Heidegger saw as displacing being, roars in. Nearly 4 pages later, the speaker recalls another kind of alienation, a moment of great tension between her and the man presumably dearest to her. When I asked you to hold me, you refused. When I asked you to cross the 6 feet of room to hold me, you refused. Dusk descends on the paralyzed pair. They are shapes the shapelessness is taking back. Why should I move? The speaker asks. It is at this point that abruptly Graham recalls Orpheus's fate. In her imagination, the bomber's deafening hum is succeeded by the roar of river cataracts and the sound of the open ocean. These are the closing lines. When the Maenads tear Orpheus limb from limb, they throw his head out into the river. Unbodied, it sings all the way downstream, all the way to the single ocean, head floating in current downriver singing. Until the sound of the cataracts grows, until the sound of the open ocean grows, and the voice. This is lyricism at the pitch of tragic joy, all but out of its head. Compared to Wright's fantasy of the godlike everlastingness of Orpheus's song, it has spine. It's refreshingly severe. but it too revises Ovid. Replacing the sadness of Orpheus's bodiless singing, it makes his voice increase in defiant volume as the sound, as distinct from voice, of the open ocean grows. Makes it challenge the grand monotony of that series of open O's, linked by droning ends. Here, then, is an exact reversal of Orpheus's ability to make nature bend its head pet-like to the strokings of his song. Graham implies that the passion for life may still sing out for dear life itself, but in a world that neither holds one nor that one can hold. World mechanical, world now permanently at war, which is how Negri and Hart describe it in their recent book, Multitude, war having gone, in their words, from being an instrument of politics used in the last resort to the foundation of politics, the basis for discipline and control. Great cataracting world of the many, dismembering propeller frenzy of a world single only in its imperial war and business machine. Graham's latest book, Overlord, is anti-lyrical in tone and in its almost throwaway art of plain communication. But yes, lyrical even so, if lyricism is a cry-born world of pain or joy. A jolt of utterance standing out from the words of the multitude. And just for that reason, as Adorno argues in his essay on the social meaning of lyric poetry, an attempt to attain universality through unrestrained individuation. In other words, the lyric is a species of a social antagonism, giving voice to what ideology hides. Nonetheless, Overlord posits a reality too repugnant, obscure, and horrifying for song. It despairs of history, which from having seemed to be linear has become vortical. And despite its series of prayer attempts, neither can the book locate and define an invisible X, or something else that would make life, as we say, bearable. I respect the adjustment of Graham's manner to the increased harshness of her subject matter. Possibly her latest state of the soul, in which beauty feels alien, is prophetic. Graham may be reading in herself, in her nerves, what the future will regard as the truest response to our times. All the same, I want to propose, as, despite its title, her book, The End of Beauty, does, that there is still a place and need in contemporary poetry for lyricism, however challenged as by centuries on night patrol at the border. It's just that the lyricism, the beauty, had better be qualified far more alertly and honestly than it is in Charles Wright's poem, even when necessary, but it isn't always necessary, twisted toward the sublime, as in What the End Is For, a poem that shudders within itself. The sublime being, as Lyotard says, perhaps the only mode of artistic sensibility to characterize the modern. In order to survive, lyricism needs, in my opinion, to get down, to cook in the jive sense, to mix it up, to get around town more. Even in and despite its beauty, it may have to turn pale, turn black, turn frosty, open its wounds to a rain of irony, bear the strain and woe of great thinking, suffer obliquity, be tossed in with prose, look through the wrong end of a telescope, have the eyes of a microscope, be as crazily angled, broken, curved, and sloped as the Frank Gehry building, wax antically imaginative, be sly, slash, do this, do that, do one or more of any number of things, a la, for instance, John Berryman, just so long as it's awake enough to smell the stench of history and realize the horror of the abyss in the black pupils of everyone's eyes, again, as Berryman did, yet it needs to pull back, as poor soul Berryman did not, perhaps could not, from a constant and poignant meism, not harp on about loss in the abstract, loss in the personal, the regret, the sourness, the sadness of it all. Thesis 2, rephrased. Poetry is now a flying circus with imaginary trapezes. It must survive, you can imagine with what good cheer, the nothing word course of history, of politics, of capitalism, of metaphysics, of quantum physics, of psychological abysses, of deconstructed language, and of an ever more gouged and filthied planet. After which one dare not name a solution, but one may name as something anyway the work of art as a creative operation, the work as work. Elaboration. Alain Badiou, perhaps the most balloon-footed of recent philosophers of aesthetics, has put forth like a huge bet on a gaming table what he calls an aesthetics of affirmation. But what he means by affirmation is identical with radical acts of subtraction. Away with classicism, with romanticism, with avant-garde didacticism. Romantic formalism, that is, the incarnational model of truth, spliced with experimental novelty, the dominant art of the last century and still so today, is, he says, imperial art. It is the Roman Empire all over again. At the end of the Roman Empire, too, art was romantic, expressive, violent, and extremely formalist, politically straight. By imperialism, Badiou means, of course, our imperialism, American. What to say of today's world, he asks in the latest issue of Lacanian Inc., and answers. A solitary power whose army is terrorizing the entire planet, dictates its law of the circulation of capital and images, and proclaims everywhere with the most extreme violence the duties and rights of everyone. Behind it run valets and rivals, Europeans, Russians, Chinese. They have no other idea of how to give value to the world. Our world, Badiou adds, is an imperial conservatism under the guise of democratic phraseology. Hence, the definition of freedom today is imperial, not democratic. To resist empire is to affirm both possibility, that is, freedom, and the work. Work not bound up with the twilight of pompous art. It's to affirm, Badiou says, the powerful impotence of the work, its fragile and implacable singularity. I'll note parenthetically that the physician recalls Adorno's on the fragile utopia of the poetic image. Please, there are seats up in front here. I don't intend to go into the intricacies, contradictions, essential familiarity, grandiosities of Badiou's position. His advocacy of an art combining an outline of the sensual and a dynamic of abstraction that combats expressivity and suggests a new universality, one contrary to the abstract universality of the market of money and power. In point of fact, the new art he calls for is by now nearly a century old, judging by his own list of affirmative artists, which includes, among others, Pessoa, Wallace Stevens, Mandelstam, Beckett, and Celan. And among painters, Picasso, Mondrian, Pollock, and Rothko. Artists who, Badiou says, have tried to undo the enterprise of romantic expressivity. I cite Badiou only as one of several theorists whose understanding of the complex conditions for creating an anti-imperial art in the modern world might well visit nightmares upon all those poets, the majority today as yesterday, who, literal and linear, offer baths of mimesis, gentle humor, sentiment, and closure, ease, not intensity, spas for the emotions. In Badiou's phrase, a lukewarmness of sharing. I have cited Badiou in particular so as to introduce the theme of subtraction, though without wishing to remain limited to his special sense of it, which is prescriptive A, eliminate the artistic imitation of capitalism's obsession with novelty, and B, eliminate the romantic obsession with sex, the body, cruelty, suffering, and death. I think it is important to throw into the mix, if not to obsess over, both elements. But in any case, what I mean by subtraction is poetry's increasing list of dispossessions, its reduction back to the darkest part of the spirit that creates it, which permits illuminations only through that darkness, It's don't shit a shitter confrontations with illusion. It's dust-ups with nothingness. All the thinkers about modern poetry who matter to me regard it as at the least a practice of social alienation, an implicit contestation with the organization of culture as it is. This last phrase is, of course, in translation, Kristeva's. Kristeva, who in Revolt, she said, argues that in the context of the uniformity that globalization has in store for us, individual revolt, individual interrogation is the only kind that can be a permanent questioning. For a poet, this practice of poetry as revolt means, so Kristeva notes, a permanent revolution in the medium of language. Violent transformations of the codes of representation. This violence heaves up when encountering an abjection that simultaneously beseeches and pulverizes the subject. It's the monstrous result of approaching the radically excluded where meaning collapses. Nonetheless, Kristeva casts the writing of individual revolt as a necessary, indeed crucial, political practice. It inserts nothingness where there was culture, but what, she asks, is the meaning of nothingness? Her optimistic answer, the possibility to rebel, change, transform. I shall return to the motif of affirmation, which insists on trumping negation in every discourse I can think of. But first I must lay out more of the terra abjecta, of the negative. Nothingness, variously called negation, lack, absence, abjection, zero in essence, and why not add Yeats's terrible phrase, the desolation of reality, is the finding of those who've looked deepest into subjectivity, language, and physics. If not an absolute term, since it is always relative to something, it means the absence of definiteness, of articulation, and hence meaning that gets exposed once anything is looked into deeply, especially if divided into its smallest parts. I'm reminded of the comment someone made about the painter Turner. Turner could make very little of the human figure once it got too close. Besides, to approach anything is to nothing it. Reeling off of Badiou's discussion of Mallarmé's The Afternoon of a Faun, we could ask, who are you, barred subject, that you presume to take charge, photographing the shine of the undecidable, in the two nymphs asleep in nothing but one another's arms, before, green interloper, you tread on it? Who knows how to enter everything, possess nothing, and pass by? Much, in fact, virtually everything that was once real is now fragged. The subject, a self-annihilating nothing, Hegel says. The phallic signifier, a fetish of itself. The big other, impotent. That which we possess, it was never ours. In Hegel's precise formulation, it only comes to be through being left behind. Substance, forget it. Force, it has crashed through you, hence the trauma that is your being. History, Canetti remarked that as of a certain point, history was no longer real. Without noticing it, all mankind left reality. Baudrillard cites Canetti's comment in his book, The Vital Illusion, and adds that the murder of the real is the perfect crime, more devastating even than the murder of God, which, though certainly painful, was symbolic and off of which we are still living, like parasites surviving for a time on a dead body. And what we used to call nature, what we must still call nature, children of the senses as we are, is itself a vital illusion, expurgated of antimatter, which, in interacting with it, would annihilate it. Particles, it seems, are not identical to themselves. Anyway, each of those we are made of is putting a spin on us. Already Baudelaire was concluding that the artist is artist only on the condition of being double. He has gone outside himself, which is to say that creative subjectivity is doubly outside, as it were, of a non-existent essence. In The Man Without Content, Giorgio Agamben remarks that the artist has no other identity than a perpetual emerging out of the nothingness of expression, and no other ground than this incomprehensible station on this side of himself. The artist may experience artistic subjectivity as absolute essence, for which all subject matter is indifferent, but it is really an in essence, the abstract in essence that dissolves every content in its continuous effort to transcend and actualize itself. Again, the artist is in the position of having to find his own essence precisely in the inessential, his content in what is mere form. I go and go, Solon says, to you, beloved, there is no mention of arrival. The truly driven, half-desperate poet, as against the decorous one, the ontologically hungry and go-for-broke poet is then empty, a failure. The creative absolute, Baudelaire cut it down to size, calling it the comique absolu, irony. Poetry becomes transparent to an unclosable subjectivity, with the consequence that as the German Romantic philosophers were already noting in the Athenaeum, the work's moments of content become fragments in search of an unnameable whole. If the work gapes open to metaphysics, it must question its own possibility as a work. For where one desires to name the infinite, one betrays it, and where one keeps silent about it, one acquiesces in one's own impotence. In any case, even as romantic art never ceases to imply the fundamental motif of completion, its particular essence is that it should forever be becoming and never be perfected. The fragment continually portends the search for a new form of fulfillment. It attempts to render the whole mobile, even while interrupting it in various ways. That being so, Romanticism opens the very epic of literature, as LeCoulibart and Nancy put it in their book, The Literary Absolute. The epic of literature, that is, as its own infinite questioning. Literature is that which has no essence, not even in its inessentiality. On to other servings up of nothingness. Consider Lacan's white-coated trickster version. You speak in order to reach into the black hat of your desire, but already the speaking dissolves the rabbit. The ever-lost object of desire, little object A, makes of poetry an exhibition of the blockage of the symbolic by the unnameable real. Little a is a huge X, even if a little mother sits in it somewhere like a tiger in a cage. And as Schlegel said, who desires something infinite does not know what he desires. Besides, though language's cultural system assigns the subject a place therein, it's a place he or she does not yet holds at no time, no how, no where. In Seminar 11, Lacan says, the subject is always eclipsed by language, or, variously, the subject slips under or behind the signifier. What is more, language could not in any case satisfy the unconscious, because, as Lyotard notes, language requires enough discontinuity to permit the existence of articuli and so block what Freud called the unconnected free cathexes of the instinctual impulses, which exist side by side without being influenced by one another and are exempt from mutual contradiction. In short, the unconscious can't hear a word you're saying. Like the cloud bursts Southerners call goose drowners, language provides a feathered thing, the linguistic mind, with a lot of water all at once from the wrong end. Consider at least two other theories as to how language and poetry gets in its own way, of how inadequate it is to its ambitions. First, in a refinement of the Athenaeum's theme of poetry as a deformity of tearings. There is Badiou's notion that the work of art is necessarily incomplete, for it cannot name what it most wants to name, namely the infinite power of language itself. For good measure, Badiou also throws in the unnameable of the poem itself, but that may be the same thing. In Handbook of Aesthetics, he remarks that every poem brings a power into language, and even goes so far as to say, ambiguously, that this power eternally fastens the disappearance of what presents itself. Nonetheless, he repeats Rimbaud's observation that the poem notes the inexpressive and fastens vertigos. The poem is mad, really. Mad as a thought that thinks it can name its own power. Mad if it believes it can effectuate locally the infinitude of language, that it can name the profound, general, and absolving source of its sophistries and piecemeal notations. Besides, the impulse to name is crossed by the impulse to attain an enigma. Badiou quotes Mallarmé, his Moorish poet, on the necessity of omission and mystery, on how, in the poem, nothing will have taken place but the place, despite some nondescript splashing below as if to disperse the empty act abruptly. Mallarmé writing against the wish to flaunt things all in the foreground imperturbably like street vendors animated by the pressure of the instant. In his introductory essay to his most recent volume of poetry, Fathom, Andrew Joran more openly treats language as abyssal, and a simple way of elucidating the point is to note that language is fashioned by no one in particular. This no one, he says, haunts language. The reader is the receiver of the sender who is no one. Like Badiou, but even more like Celan, Joran welcomes the infinite anonymity of language, which supports the possibility that in language truth may be sent infinitely underway to itself. The door is open. Go, go. Yet, unlike Badiou, who peaceably notes that the 20th century's entire effort was to be cured of the sickness of Plato, of an ideality directed against the creative immanence of life, its energetic differentiation, Joran is ceaselessly Platonic, and with a flashcard directness. Like Adorno, Badiou, and even Debord, he rejoices in art's powerful impotence, its irrelevance to the course of empire, its poor consumer ratings, a sign that there might be something to it after all. What good, Joran asks, is poetry at a time like this? He names the usual ideas, the power to unclothe ideology, to give voice to what has been denied voice, to counsel, to console, and so on, and then proposes an unusual and paradoxical value, namely poetry's power to sing the blues, by which he means not at all a world of pathos, but a swerve counter to the cumulative, an alignment with what is missing while everything else is massing here. In a society that can achieve unity only through hatred of an external army, in a war of annihilative vengeance, to lie down with defeat, Joran argues, to play the game of decay's cadences, to help the decanted words flow back into the vessel's mouth, is to veer toward victory. Poetry triumphs only in turning its grieving vowels away from the edged I toward the inexpressible, the ideal's no to this world, zeros, rows. Traditional aesthetic practices, Joran says, may not make room enough for this revolt. His own method consists of an interactive field of discrete aphorisms and images. Yet even Joran, though nostalgic for a full void, cannot subtract from poetry its necessary vulgar element of apparitions, the affirmation of things traced in words which are themselves, however, equivocally things. I quote from Torn Space Around Poe in his second book, his best, The Removes. The dots, the ellipsis is his. It's how the poem begins. It expresses to make his desire to make all of his poetry. 3 dots. What a desperate trance. The skyboat resembles a flying vulva. The city, the arc of an abandoned soliloquy. Writing is disguised as perception's ghost, a nocturnal substance to be spread by the sun. In the future, flames will possess the stillness of objects stolen from the past. Eyes, the emblems of the invisible. Hands, the instruments of renunciation. Head, a crumbling turret that at evening collects such thoughts like crows. There exists a set of objects made up of those objects that do not belong to any set. There exists an uncorrupted text, a boat built out of the sliding surfaces of the sea. But thus to stage the void, and I don't mean this as an undercutting criticism, is thus to corrupt it precisely as text. The negatives keep rising, one beside the other, forming a circle of palisades, with unseen truth doing something unspeakable in the fortress, boiling water for cosmic broth or cooking heads. Consider Adorno's theory that the repressed of poetry is a primordial shudder, what Marguerite Duras calls writing's wild return to a savage state from before life itself, the savageness of force, as ancient as time, the fear of everything inseparable from life itself. Great modern art remembers spirit's first howls. Adorno writes, aesthetics cannot hope to grasp modern works of art if it treats them as hermeneutical objects. What needs to be grasped is their unintelligibility. Again, art is the epiphany of the hidden essence of reality. Unless these words from Adorno's great overstuffed book, Aesthetic Theory, seem comfortable with the notion of essence, I will add his statement that today it is denied works of art that they reach an inner destination, which means the works are deficient. It's not just that art is wary of the ideal of harmony because it suggests that art has sold out to the administered world. It is also that art today is ashamed of apparition without being able to throw it off. Art has become transparent to itself down to the very core, which is the constitutive nature of illusion. This illusion undermines the possibility of art itself. Faced with what Adorno calls the trajectory of increasing negativity in modern thought, the predicament of poetry is how to be positive enough to justify itself as revolt, how to be powerful though impotent, how to be importantly impotent among the powerful. Spectacular revelation would be best, but nobody's having that. Nowadays, the poet has every encouragement to just scuff the dirt after a juddering mimesis has quieted down, but nobody wants that either. What to do? How breathe new oxygen into the lyric if a hedgehog of negatives is already pressed to its pretty red heart? The heart William Blake rightly named a hungry gorge. How be other than obliquely self-reflective, as one writes in one's inky cloak, with no one near to hand one in a short, plain, explanatory letter, one's subito entire? Without the positive of a bearable history of the real, of God, of the one, of the truth of the word, of the fruits of desire, of myth, of the docile fragment, how find the spirit to write, other than with that jaunty, taunting, unforgiving comic tone, either surfacey or deep, in the work of some of the younger contemporary poets, thanks in part to John Ashbery's example? Married to the void as the poet is, without minister, ring, gown, or honeymoon. I'm reminded of the opening words of Beckett's worst word, ho, on, say on, be said on, somehow on, a piece that ends with the words said no-how on. As Gertrude Stein more simply says in Mrs. Emerson, I go on, begun, is to write without a meism of expressivity then an act of exemplary self-denial. "You shouldn't admire my fasting," said the hunger artist. "I have to fast. I couldn't find the food I liked. If I had found it, believe me, I should have made no fuss and stuffed myself like you and everyone else." One reason to write is to renew over and over the formal structure of promise, as a gesture, perhaps even more than a gesture of revolt. As mentioned earlier, Kristeva thinks of the writing of revolt as starting over. Indeed, the theorists I've mentioned agree with Sauer Beckett that poetry sustains in its grasshopper flashes of flight the idea of the yet to come. Valerie spoke of the longing to create some work revealing more power and perfection than we know we possess. The poem grows still, intent, watchful, to see what remains for it to lead to. Like a cat that can tell from a small wave motion under the wet autumn leaves that something alive is scurrying there. As if the poem believed with Joran in no difference between immanence and imminence. Now, Ernest Laclau argues that democracy too is about the yet to come. Freedom only exists, Laclau says, in emancipation, insofar as the achievement of a total freedom is an ever-receding horizon. As in poetry, so in democracy, as Laclau understands it, promise is what you have in place of foundations. With Sorel and Gramsci, he notes the Marxist anchoring of social representations in the ontological bedrock of an objective history starts to dissolve. History becomes an open and contingent process that does not reflect any deeper underlying reality. The subsequent terrain of lost foundations is, Laclau says, a terrain of radicalization of the decision. He aligns his idea of emancipation with Derrida's concept of democracy to come. The structure of promise, he says, is inherent in all experience. Its lack of content is the very possibility of justice. Laclau's relocation of revolution within reform predicates a plurality of convictions that would perhaps still drip the dirt and blood of foundations. Where else would the convictions come from? But let that be. Here is a homology such as it is between democracy, if only in its aggregative model, not its deliberative universalizing model, and the romantic to postmodernist idea of literature as pursuing fulfillment in a new but always receding whole. Again, the romantic kind of poetry, in words from the Athenaeum, is still becoming. That is its real essence, that it should forever be becoming and never be perfected. In keeping, Adorno says that the unquenchable longing excited by the beautiful is the longing for the fulfillment of a promise. Even Badiou, though rejecting the saturation of romantic promise in Heidegger's rhetorical equipment and despising the present state of American democracy, declares that politics truly means the creation of a new possibility and that artistic creation is a part of human emancipation, not an ornament. There is something political, he says, in art itself. Then, too, Charles Olson observes that the present is prologue, you as the only reader and mover of the instant. And in the most subtle, severe, and brilliant of these reflections, Bakhtin notes that, like everything that exists, the word exists without justification, having dared, as it were, to become already determinate within a world the whole of which is yet to be in respect of its meaning and justification. The word seeks to become totally determined within the sentence we have not yet finished saying and thinking through to the end. So long as the word remained unsaid, he adds, one could still look forward to the compelling fullness of meaning. But when the word is pronounced, all of it is here and there is nothing else. Indeed, it sounds hopeless in its already pronouncedness. Everything then, atom, word, your thought, your feeling, your cat, is alive only in transit, its promise. Hence the need to say on, be said on, somehow on. So the practice of the yet to be in poetry is paralleled by a certain formula, if not practice, of democracy. After all, as Adorno remarked, the idea of an open society rose simultaneously with that of an open poetry, open to the fracturingly heterogeneous, the radically other, something unfinished, instead of a presence closed in on itself. But the current disgust with an imperial, a rigged democracy, in this country, perhaps it began as early as Robert Lowell. Our wheels no longer move. Look, the fixed stars, all just alike as land atoms split apart, and the Republic summons Ike, the mausoleum in her heart. This disgust wishes to position poetry's to come, not as a parallel even to the best current practice of democracy, but instead as anti-cultural revolt. The revolt, he says, the revolt, she says, individual revolt, individual interrogation. It is better to do nothing, Badiou chimes in, with his flair for a strong position, than to work officially in the visibility of what the West declares to exist. As does Adorno with his remark that an innocent art is a guilty art. After all, the task of any avant-garde, as Debord observed, is to keep abreast of reality. If artists, together with philosophers, don't do it, who will? Echoing Barthes, we might add that the specific task of the poet is to retreat ahead of language produced and spread under the protection of power. The writer is the joker in the pack, free of any fixed meaning, if also deprived of it. In addition to strategic interference with received representational codes, modern poetry withstands nothingness through poetry's perennial merit of exquisitely organized language, craftier than is found elsewhere, sovereign, an implicit rebuke to the limits, frayings, and soilings of workaday language. Despite being anti-classical, even Badiou insists on a Greek principle of completion, precisely because it is art that creates finitude, so he suggests the work of art properly moves within the fulfillment of its own limit and displays all perfection of which it is capable. Which means, as Valery argued, that the work has to be closed enough to give itself its own stamp, to heal itself of the contingency which renders it unequal to the dimensions of the real. As opposed to the calculatedly short shelf life of capitalist products and technologies, art earns from within its right to be just as it is, left to what it will always be, every touch-up or modification, either inessential or destructive. What a good thing, notes Debord, that the poem is not consumable, is not of equivalent value for each of a mass of isolated passive consumers, can be encountered only if one turns aside from one's normal course. Yet, in still another of modern poetry's predicaments, poets must now pursue perfection without knowing in advance what it will be. Given the breakdown of the transmissibility of culture, which Agamben identifies as beginning with Baudelaire, poets have to rely on rouges, on gaming. As Frank O'Hara said, you just go on your nerve. Then, too, since the modern poem is the opposite of a mimesis, it's notable for imaginative energy, cunning, and freedom. Imaginative rightness is the almost luxurious lining of poetry's infinite questioning, including, of course, its self-questioning. Whatever the truth and mystifications of inspiration, artistic creativity falls within the category of the will. It is unimaginable without it. In the 19th century, metaphysics had at last thought its way through to will as the most intimate element of being. Witness Schelling, will is primordial being. I know myself and want myself because I want my will. In me, knowing and willing are unified. If the poem knows the sensible only in outline, the reason is that the secondary order of being, the imagination, which for the poet is the primary order, quotes it at a remove that the will desires, for all poetry's frequent complaints to the contrary. It's in this sense that the poem is in its very medium and operation a terrestrial affirmation. It's a staghorn branch of biological exuberance, of the energetics of the earth. What the imagination quotes, if only to alter it, is also of the earth, as, once more, even Jorun's would-be off-the-earth poems are forced to display. In an interview published in a recent Denver Quarterly, I argued for the validity of a poetry in which nature continues to figure as the primal shock it is, inasmuch as our brains bother the haze of what is called the symbolic order, are open to it, even in the sky above a tenement, like an antelope to a jaguar. But since there is so much to say about my present topic, I won't develop the suggestion here. Instead, I take the opportunity to stress the other half of the case, to repeat after Proust that we cannot imagine what is present, and after Sartre that the imagination exists precisely to the degree that it annihilates the very thing it would appear to make present, annihilates it by representing it. Is the imagination condemned to be a famine? Perhaps, but the aqua tank on its hill holds quantities of qua for it. A vacancy sign brightens the virtual actual. The modern poem changes perception into a problem, as Bedient says, lifts it into the incommunicable, the strange, into the region of the possible real, but not without dropping sensible breadcrumbs on the way to the infinite. After all, the imagination is by nature bound to choose the side of energy over against abstract empire. Energy, which Blake called evil, being a rejection of subservience, a lyrical infraction of the law. I shall end with a brief sampling of recent poems that feel negativity in the bone, yet survive it with some spirit, with increasing spirit as we go from one to the other. In regarding them, I shall raise the question, which by now I fear seems fairly quashed by all that weighs against it, of the continued relevance of a lyrical component in poetry. First, Caroline Forché's On Earth, the long abecedarian poem in Blue Hour. Forché had already cut back from the lyrical quotient, the personal and ardently liberal quotient of pathos in her second book, A Country Between Us, which, to her dismay, outraged the parochial meism of the conservative American poetic establishment. In reaction, she turned humble to the point of self-abnegation, first in The Angel of History, then in Blue Hour. On Earth goes so far as to be a motley heap of one-line fragments from which the pronouns I and me are almost completely debarred. The notion of oneness and even of harmony survives only in its own dust. Here, what Adorno calls the true transcendence in the work of art, its integration of its own moments, is not even a memory. At most, the poem juxtaposes random notations of physical things, some beautiful in their simplicity, some dull, with metaphysical statements that tersely imply an access to revealed truth. I quote two successive lines by way of illustration. Snow through open windows, soul on its way toward earth. Anti-romantic, On Earth posits infinity, a foundation, but shrinks from the imaginative task of infiltrating finite fragments with the promise of the whole. Fearful of the narcissism of lyricism, it virtually forgoes the will to shape from inside with a concerted passion, with testosterone, with clamor, the violence of song. In contrast, though still within the precincts of the sacred, in fact on the grounds of Catholic theology, is Fanny Howe's latest book of poems, On the Ground. In many of its patchy groups of lines, there's a brave assumption of lyricism, but only on the condition and at the cost of a jagged practice of it. The third person is a materialist, Howe writes in her poem 9/11. The first person is an existentialist. So then, she sanctions the first person, but she doesn't underestimate its adversaries. Political alarm has her looking down on Utah as if it was Saudi Arabia or Pakistan. The same alarm, plus a slakeless thirst for the sacred, leads her to the following equivocal image of the East, and this is in your handout. All of us seem to be transfixed, stacked as we are facing East, week after week, a little like one of the ones who were invited to light. Through many volumes, Howe has displayed a will to be slashing, abrupt, alienated, unforgiving, furiously fast, too leathery for pathos, in short, truly contemporary. At times, she's breathtakingly imaginative, at other times, forcefully direct. And if this sounds like the Robert Lowell of, say, the nihilist as hero, Lowell is our contemporary. How to be lyrical and at the same time unappeasable. Consider Howe's lines, these two are in the handout. Poetry, pure liquid at the core of something sweet and short, is a rose already pink inside its idiot dirt. It's like Stein piloting a speedboat. Intensity is Howe's lifeline. Intensity that leads beyond pleasure to unease and the limits of consciousness. Intensity, lest there be nothing. What of considerably younger poets today? A number have already displayed a deft ability both to work the negatives and to stand up to them. I shall name only two poets, both of whom have yet to publish a book, Steve Willard and Karen Garth. Garth's first book will be published in the fall as this year's winner of the Colorado Prize. In these poets, avant-garde modernism is alive, greased, agile, on the prowl, unapologetic. You either get their work or you don't. It's hard stuff. Though young, the poets seem already to have felt all the goads to a potentially crippling self-consciousness, absorbed all the negatives. You'd think they'd gone to kindergarten with the critiques of subjectivity, language, difference, closure, a curriculum of troubles. But they respond to the dissolution of foundations as if they would anyway rise up like irrepressible fountains. Here, in fact, is the beginning and end of Willard's poem, What Little Fountains We Are. What little fountains we are. What with the differences. Nothing to be ashamed of. Some of our fathers were perfumed spit out of the precious mouth, treasure at the bottom of a fountain neck, cocked back held by the red hair. We throw victory, our birth, to the hollow air, like breath capped in the dark trunk of a tree by the changing climate, a long way from the apartment holding the oboe's female scent, suffering not yet expanded us past the window. Even so, the window is open. There is no reason to make us a freeze of it. Little fountains that we are, we recklessly and not without biological exuberance throw our birthright, our will, and in that sense our victory, into the empty, now hollow air. Nonetheless, not to make too much of this automatic self-uplift and minor self-dispersal, our subjectivity feels trapped as if in the dark trunk of a tree, for it is still and always subject to ignorance and change. Distant we are from the music, from the geometries and domesticities of a transmissible culture, but, well, the window is open, experience is open, we were suffered to depart, even if we haven't significantly expanded beyond the window, so be it. Let us not, in any case, make a freeze of, not freeze the frame we have passed through and exceeded. The lines illustrate what Badiou calls the necessary incommunicability of the new art, which means, at the least, its rejection of a slick and childish eagerness to entertain. There is in it no whine. There is in this poem no whine, no lament, no nostalgia. On the other hand, no illusory exultation either, for the victory it speaks of is mercilessly qualified. Is What Little Fountains We Are non-lyrical? I think not. Though its lyricism is subdued, it's not only a poem about feeling, the feeling of suffering and enjoying a finite state of openness, a state more problematical, if more possible, than the traditional spiritualist approach to the infinite, the one illustrated in Charles Wright, Porcher, Joran, and Fanny Howe. In addition, the lines thicken with connotations. Both the syntax and the images are charged with feeling. I'll close with a few words from and about Karen Garth by way of still further illustrating the kind of sophistication, sang-froid, and out-of-nowhere inventiveness appearing here and there in the work of young poets. Like Willard's, Garth's lines sound fundamentally strange and foreign, partly for the reason that she too slips and leaps about with a William Jamesian certainty that experience remolds us at every moment, that to follow a straight line and not zigzag is to do violence to the continual infiltration of otherness in our experience, violence to the rule of serial non-identity. But here, in the concluding lines of La Vie de Marpa, Garth relents just a bit from her usual difficulty and thematizes her own decrowning and recrowning practice. For she, like her protagonist, is a contortionist who turns so completely inside out that her house, that is, call it modern culture, is in her lap. The contortionist sits, his house in his lap. The junta is in the cafe, doing the bursting lines. Marpa seizes his master's stick in a room of unnecessary things, plays saffron strings, mist over Marpa. The poem is a mischievous rewrite of the life of the Tibetan guru Marpa, whose master was Naropa. It's a tribute to the imagination's ability to take the dry stick of the master and make music with it, music spice, and a freeing mist. Here is an art that replaces the I with new figures and intensities. All the same, it recognizes the individual as the source of revolt. Gone is the precious air of the auratic. A sort of dauntless and sweet impertinence takes its place. With poets like Willard and Garth, and again they are but representative of a parcel of young poet talents, poetry has more than a fair chance of surviving its predicaments with a display of brilliant agility and aplomb, a chance to hold, as Celan said, its ground on its own margin. I've argued that the condition of this achievement is an unflinching lucidity about the predicament itself. Here the bullet comes. Catch it, use its violence as if it were silver. Yes.